In a shocking turn of events, fake HOA officers took things too far when they pulled a taser on a black woman in her own neighborhood. What they didn't know was that she was no ordinary woman. She was a highly trained Special Forces operative prepared to fight back. What followed was a battle of courage, power, and justice, turning a routine confrontation into a life-changing moment. A quiet suburban neighborhood, typically filled with the hum of daily life, becomes a place of comfort and routine for its residents. Tree-lined streets, meticulously maintained lawns, and the occasional sound of children playing in their front yards. This was the scene that had long characterized the peaceful existence of the people who called this neighborhood home. It was a typical day for most residents, with many going about their business with little more than a passing thought for the affairs of the community that seemed to operate so smoothly. But for one woman, that day would be marked by an event that would shatter the calm and expose a deep-seated flaw in the system that was supposed to protect her. On this particular morning, the neighborhood's serenity was interrupted by the arrival of two individuals claiming to be members of the Homeowners Association, HOA. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary figures one might expect in a community that prided itself on order and decorum. The presence of an HOA was usually associated with the maintenance of rules and regulations designed to keep the neighborhood clean and well-maintained. However, unbeknownst to the residents, the individuals who walked into this neighborhood that day were not legitimate members of the HOA. They were imposters, people who had taken it upon themselves to act in an authoritative manner without any legal or official standing. For the woman in question, a highly trained and disciplined Special Forces operative, the intrusion by these self-proclaimed officers was unexpected, but not entirely shocking. Over the years, she had learned to navigate all types of situations with a level-headed and cautious approach. It wasn't uncommon to see community figures, whether in the form of HOA representatives, local officials, or even neighbors, try to assert power or impose rules in ways that weren't always entirely lawful or fair. What was unusual, however, was the manner in which these individuals presented themselves. They approached with a kind of aggression and authority that seemed out of place in this peaceful setting, and their conduct quickly escalated when the woman didn't immediately comply with their demands. At first, they approached her as if they had every right to be in her personal space. They demanded that she adhere to certain regulations, referring to vague rules they claimed were part of the HOA's guidelines. They were quick to assume that she would simply fall in line, trusting that the title of officer was enough to intimidate her into submission. However, the woman wasn't one to bow to intimidation, especially not from individuals who couldn't even provide proper identification or proof of their authority. She stood her ground, not out of defiance, but out of principle. She had been trained to read people, to assess situations, and to react with a level of precision that few could understand. These so-called officers, on the other hand, seemed to be relying on force and threats rather than reason and legal backing. What followed was an escalation that could have easily been avoided if the individuals had simply exercised patience and understanding. Instead, they doubled down on their authority, growing increasingly aggressive as they realized they weren't going to get the response they expected. Their approach shifted from demanding compliance to issuing threats, with one of the officers reaching for a taser, as if this would somehow force the woman into submission. They misjudged her entirely. For the woman, this wasn't just a confrontation. It wasn't about the rules of the HOA or the regulations they tried to impose. It was about respect, integrity, and the right to stand up for oneself in the face of unlawful authority. She knew the risks of engaging with such individuals, but she also understood the importance of asserting boundaries, particularly when those boundaries were being violated. This was a moment of reckoning, not just for her, but for the community as a whole. The quiet neighborhood that had long been defined by its calm and orderly nature was suddenly thrust into an atmosphere of tension, all because two individuals had overstepped their bounds. The question that lingered in the air was not just about the confrontation itself, but about how easily such incidents could spiral out of control when power was misused. It wasn't just a matter of enforcing rules. It was about how people in positions of perceived authority could manipulate their roles to control and intimidate others. In this case, they had picked the wrong person. The woman's calm demeanor and controlled response masked a deeper strength, one that was forged through years of rigorous training and experience. She wasn't someone who could be intimidated or manipulated by empty threats. The neighborhood that had once been the epitome of suburban tranquility now found itself caught in a ripple of uncertainty. What had seemed like a normal interaction had quickly escalated into something far more dangerous, an incident that would leave its residents questioning how far the overreach of those in power could go. The quiet suburban streets, once the symbol of peace, now stood as a backdrop to a story of resistance, strength, and the importance of standing up to those who seek to impose control without justification. The woman, in the face of these fake officers, had inadvertently become a symbol of resilience, proving that even in the most unexpected circumstances, it was possible to challenge those who believed their authority was untouchable. The so-called HOA officers had no legitimate authority, yet they operated with a sense of entitlement that suggested otherwise. Upon arriving in the neighborhood, their approach was calculated and quick, as if they expected to dominate the situation simply by presenting themselves as figures of authority. In many communities, HOA members are tasked with upholding neighborhood rules and ensuring that residents adhere to specific guidelines. However, their role is not supposed to extend to aggressive enforcement or intimidation. The so-called officers, however, appeared to believe that their presence alone would command respect and compliance from everyone they encountered. Their first move was to demand that the woman comply with certain vague and arbitrary rules, which they claimed were part of the HOA's jurisdiction. These rules were neither clearly defined nor substantiated with documentation, which should have immediately raised red flags for anyone familiar with how legitimate HOA operations function. Nevertheless, the officers pressed forward with their demands. The assumption they operated under was clear. They believed their position, whether real or fabricated, was enough to subdue anyone who questioned their authority. What these individuals failed to understand was that the woman, despite appearing like any other resident, was not someone who would yield to unfounded authority. She had a deep sense of self-respect, and her years of training had given her a strong sense of judgment and the ability to assess situations from multiple angles. When the officers began issuing commands that made little sense or lacked supporting evidence, she questioned them. She asked for proper identification, for clarification of the rules they were claiming she had violated, and for any proof of their official capacity to enforce such rules. In response to her simple requests for accountability, the officers did not pause to provide the expected documentation or explanation. Instead, they resorted to what they believed would be a simple tactic to instill fear and force compliance: the display of a taser. The sight of a taser being pulled from one of the officers' belts was intended to be a show of force, a physical manifestation of their perceived control over the situation. In many cases, such a display of a weapon, especially a taser, would be enough to cause someone to back down, especially if they were not prepared to deal with such an escalation. The officers seemed to think that the mere presence of the taser would be enough to intimidate the woman into submission. They assumed that pulling the weapon would be the decisive factor in controlling her actions. But they completely misjudged the situation. What they did not anticipate was the woman's composed demeanor, which was not an indication of weakness or fear, but of immense self-control. Her years of training in high-stress environments where the stakes were often life or death had taught her how to remain calm in the face of physical threats. She did not panic, nor did she flinch when the taser was brandished before her. Instead, she assessed the officers calmly, recognizing the gravity of the situation, but refusing to be moved by their bluff. The officers' decision to brandish a weapon was an error, as it revealed their inability to handle conflict through dialogue or reason. It was an attempt to force compliance through intimidation, an approach that often leads to escalation rather than resolution. The weapon in this case was not a deterrent. Instead, it highlighted the officers' inability to handle the situation with maturity or professionalism. They were relying on the threat of violence to achieve their goals, assuming that their display of power would be sufficient to control the woman's actions. In a legitimate setting, where true authority is present, such an interaction might have been handled differently, perhaps through calm negotiation or an exchange of documents to clarify the situation. But in this case, the officers resorted to an aggressive move that only exposed their lack of legitimacy and their desperate need to control the outcome by any means necessary. The woman's response to the taser was a critical moment in the escalation. While many people might have been rattled by the threat of being tased, she understood that fear could be used against her. She did not give in to the officers' pressure, nor did she allow their intimidation tactics to cloud her judgment. She knew that if she allowed herself to become fearful, it would only empower them further. So rather than succumb to fear, she maintained her composure, staying firmly rooted in her resolve. The fake officers, on the other hand, misread the situation completely. Their reliance on the weapon as a means of gaining control was a clear sign of their inability to assert real authority. In their minds, showing the taser was a simple way to win the confrontation. They didn't understand that true control comes from understanding the situation, maintaining the moral high ground, and resolving conflicts without resorting to force. They were operating in a mindset that was rooted in aggression, not genuine leadership or conflict resolution. At the core of this miscalculation was the officers' underestimation of the woman's strength. They assumed that their display of a taser would be enough to break her will, but they failed to see that she was not someone who could be intimidated into submission. They didn't realize that she had dealt with far greater threats in the past, threats that required far more than just a show of force to overcome. Her experience had taught her that intimidation is often a sign of weakness, and that people who rely on weapons to assert their dominance often do so because they lack the ability to deal with situations through reasoning or dialogue. The officers' move to brandish the taser ultimately backfired. It highlighted their insecurity, their lack of proper authority, and their inability to handle situations with the grace and professionalism that should come with any form of leadership. In trying to assert control through fear, they exposed themselves as nothing more than imposters, with no true power to back up their actions. Their failure to recognize the woman's inner strength was the key to their downfall. They miscalculated her response, and in doing so they revealed their own inability to handle conflict without resorting to violence. The woman's strength, though unseen at first, was not a product of mere physical conditioning or sheer force. It was the result of years of training in some of the most extreme environments, where the stakes were often life and death. Her calm demeanor, which could have been mistaken for passivity, was instead a reflection of her inner discipline and ability to maintain control in situations that would overwhelm most people. This ability to stay calm and assess a potentially dangerous scenario was the cornerstone of her strength. In her world, composed decision-making and clear judgment were essential, and she had honed these traits over time, preparing herself for moments when the only choice was to act swiftly and with precision. For most people, facing an unprovoked confrontation would be unsettling. The immediate instinct is often to react based on fear or anger. However, the woman was no stranger to high-pressure situations. She had been trained to overcome not just physical challenges, but mental ones as well. The discipline required to survive in her line of work was unlike that of any average person. It demanded resilience, focus, and an ability to think critically under intense stress. The fake HOA officers, in their rush to impose their false authority, failed to recognize the depth of the woman's capabilities. And it was this oversight that would lead to their miscalculation. Her years of service in special forces had not only developed her physical abilities, but also instilled in her an unshakable mental fortitude. She had learned to remain grounded, even when faced with overwhelming odds. The ability to assess threats without allowing fear to cloud judgment was something she had mastered. In this moment, standing before two individuals who thought they could intimidate her, she was operating from a place of strength that came from a far deeper well than the officers could ever comprehend. The essence of her strength was rooted in training that went beyond the physical. It was about adaptability, strategy, and the ability to read the situation as it unfolded. In an environment like the one she had trained in, quick thinking was often the difference between life and death. Every scenario was a complex series of variables that required calculated responses. The woman had spent years developing the skill to stay calm, to read the dynamics of any situation, and to make decisions that balanced risk with reward. Her training had equipped her to see past the immediate threat to the underlying factors at play, enabling her to take actions that were precise, deliberate, and effective. This ability to process information swiftly was complemented by a keen awareness of her surroundings. The woman didn't need to be physically threatened to know the outcome of the situation. She had been in far more intense confrontations before, where the line between success and failure was razor thin. Her expertise allowed her to stay 2 steps ahead of the officers, even when they believed they were in control. They misjudged her calmness as submission, not recognizing that it was the mark of someone who had the power to act, but chose not to until the moment demanded it. Additionally, her strength came from an unyielding belief in self-respect and integrity. In her training, she had been taught that the most important battles are often the ones that take place within, between one's impulses and one's principles. She had learned to trust herself and her instincts, knowing that personal integrity could never be compromised. The decisions she made were not only tactical, but also grounded in a deep sense of honor and the understanding that real strength was shown in the restraint she exercised. In every action, whether in the field or in everyday life, she operated with a clear sense of what was right, and this clarity enabled her to maintain control over herself and the situation, no matter how aggressive her adversaries became. Another key element of her strength was her ability to de-escalate situations, which was something that her training had emphasized. In any tense confrontation, the first reaction might be to escalate. This was the instinct of many. However, the woman had been taught to assess the escalation and choose whether to allow it to happen or to break the cycle. Her internal process was simple yet profound: assess, understand, then act. In this case, she recognized that the officers, in their attempt to assert dominance through aggression, were merely reacting from a place of insecurity. By remaining calm and composed, she took control of the situation, not by matching their aggression, but by refusing to engage with their tactics. This silent refusal to participate in their power play was an indication of strength that they failed to recognize. Her ability to withstand such pressure was also a testament to her physical resilience. Special Forces training often involved physical endurance that pushed the body to its limits, teaching soldiers how to push through exhaustion, hunger, and pain. While this woman was not engaged in a physical struggle at that moment, the mental endurance she had developed from years of enduring hardship was evident in her demeanor. She was not fazed by the officers' threats or intimidation tactics. To her, this confrontation was just another challenge, one that she was equipped to handle with poise. Furthermore, her strength was marked by her deep understanding of the power of non-reaction. In high-stakes environments, sometimes the best response is no response at all. She knew that the officers were seeking a reaction, and by refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled, she maintained the upper hand. In the world she came from, the ability to keep emotions in check, especially when confronted by aggressive behavior, was invaluable. This was a lesson she had learned and internalized, that the true measure of power lies not in outward displays, but in the ability to control one's emotions and actions in the face of provocation. In essence, the woman's strength was not derived from brute force or sheer physicality, but from a combination of inner discipline, mental resilience, and strategic thinking that allowed her to stay calm under pressure. Her strength was silent, unassuming, and unwavering. It was a strength forged through years of experience, not just in physical combat, but in the complex mental battles that arose from difficult situations. The officers, in their haste to exert power, failed to realize that true power wasn't about domination. It was about control over oneself, one's emotions, and one's actions. The woman had mastered all three, making her the last person anyone should underestimate. As the situation unfolded, the officers began to sense that their initial approach was failing. What had started as a straightforward attempt to assert control, one they assumed would go unchallenged, was now spiraling into something they were not prepared for. Initially, their confidence had been high, believing that their display of authority, marked by the brandishing of the taser, would intimidate the woman into submission. However, as they realized she was neither frightened nor compliant, their confidence wavered, and with it the power dynamic shifted. The officers had miscalculated their ability to assert control over a situation that was rapidly slipping from their grasp. The woman, aware of the mounting tension, remained poised, evaluating the situation with the precision that only someone with her experience could maintain. Her training had taught her that situations like this, where authority was being misused, could escalate quickly if not handled carefully. She knew that keeping her composure was critical, not just for her safety, but for the integrity of the moment. Her calm and controlled response contrasted sharply with the increasingly erratic behavior of the officers. They had been expecting an easy confrontation, but what they faced was a woman who not only refused to back down, but who was now actively challenging their authority. This sudden shift in the balance of power made the officers feel threatened, leading them to become even more desperate. As the woman continued to question their legitimacy and demand evidence of their authority, the officers struggled to provide clear answers or any form of identification that would validate their claims. With each passing moment, their authority seemed weaker and their frustration mounted. In an attempt to reassert control, one of the officers made a critical mistake. Rather than engaging in the rational discourse that could have diffused the situation, they chose to escalate the conflict further. They began to raise their voices, becoming more aggressive, but this only deepened the divide between them and the woman. Their tactic of intimidation through force was no longer effective. In the face of this escalation, the woman remained unshaken. Her military background had ingrained in her the importance of strategic thinking, of assessing the situation, understanding the dynamics at play, and acting in a manner that would turn the tide in her favor. She knew that these officers, in their attempt to escalate the confrontation, were making a critical error. They were acting out of frustration, not out of genuine authority. This realization gave her a tactical advantage. The officers, in their attempt to dominate, were becoming increasingly reckless, revealing the cracks in their facade of control. The woman recognized that her best option was not to meet aggression with aggression, but to exploit the officers' lack of composure and expose their vulnerability. Their overreach was not just a sign of desperation, it was an opportunity to challenge their false authority. By staying calm and focused, she was able to keep the upper hand, while the officers, in their bid to reassert themselves, only dug themselves deeper into a hole of their own making. Each attempt they made to escalate the situation served to reinforce the idea that they were not legitimate authorities, but imposters, struggling to control a situation they were ill-equipped to handle. The dynamic between the officers and the woman quickly became a battle of wills. The officers, who initially saw themselves as the dominant figures, now found themselves on the defensive. They had underestimated their opponent, believing that their appearance of authority would be enough to intimidate her into compliance. But the woman's response demonstrated that power does not lie in intimidation, it lies in control. As the officers grew more agitated, their actions became less measured, and their ability to maintain control over the situation diminished. It was clear that they had no real plan for managing the confrontation, and their reliance on fear tactics only exposed their weakness. In many high-stress confrontations, there is a tendency for both parties to become more entrenched in their positions. However, the woman's approach was different. Rather than falling into the trap of escalating the situation through anger or violence, she maintained her stance with quiet confidence. This level-headedness served not only to disarm the officers, but also to highlight the absurdity of their actions. By refusing to engage with their provocations, she was able to turn the officers' aggression back onto them. They were no longer in control of the situation. She was. As the confrontation reached its peak, the officers found themselves at a crossroads. Their options were limited. They could either continue to escalate, risking further exposure of their lack of authority, or they could back down, admitting their mistake and walking away. The tension in the air was palpable, But the woman's composed demeanor made it clear that the power dynamic had shifted. The officers had overreached, and they were now faced with the uncomfortable reality that their authority was not as absolute as they had believed. The more they tried to assert control, the more they exposed their inability to do so effectively. This moment of realization was critical. The officers, having failed to intimidate the woman into submission, were now forced to reconsider their actions. The situation had gone from an attempt at control to a standoff, one that was no longer about enforcing rules or maintaining authority, but about personal pride and the struggle for dominance. The woman, on the other hand, had recognized the true nature of the situation from the outset. Her strength lay in her ability to keep a clear head, to remain calm and rational when the officer's aggression was escalating, and to outmaneuver them mentally. The tension had reached its peak, and now it was a question of how the officers would react to the realization that they were not in control. In the end, the escalation was not just a breakdown of the confrontation itself, but a collapse of the false authority that the officers had sought to impose. They had miscalculated the power dynamic, and in doing so, they had revealed their own vulnerabilities. The woman had not only stood her ground, but she had turned the situation to her advantage. What had begun as a simple overreach of power had now become a significant moment of reckoning for the officers, one that would leave them questioning the true limits of their authority. The aftermath of the confrontation marked a significant turning point, not just for the woman involved, but for the entire community. What had begun as a seemingly routine dispute escalated into a clear illustration of the dangers posed by individuals who overstep their boundaries and abuse power. The fake HOA officers, who had initially approached the situation with an air of assumed authority, were soon exposed for their actions. Their lack of legitimacy, once concealed behind a veil of false bravado, became apparent to everyone. Their deceit was no longer hidden, and the truth had come to light thanks to the woman's unwavering courage and her refusal to yield in the face of unlawful authority. The exposure of these fake officers was a critical moment. It was not just about one individual standing up for herself. It was about highlighting a systemic issue that could easily go unchecked. The officers had operated under the assumption that their perceived authority would be enough to control the situation, but their exposure raised an important question. How many others had faced similar abuses of power in silence? How many residents had been intimidated, manipulated, or harassed by individuals pretending to hold positions of authority, only to remain silent for fear of retaliation or confusion about their rights? The woman's stand against the officers opened the door for this larger conversation. By simply refusing to comply with what she knew were unjust demands, the woman set off a ripple effect that would resonate throughout the neighborhood, and perhaps even beyond. Her bravery not only exposed the corruption of these officers, but it also shed light on the broader issue of unchecked authority. The officers were not an isolated incident, but a part of a much larger problem, a lack of accountability and transparency in positions of power. When people, whether they are HOA members, local officials, or anyone in a position of perceived authority, act without the proper checks and balances, it becomes easy for them to manipulate others. This situation demonstrated how easily the lines between genuine authority and exploitation could become blurred. The woman's actions became a catalyst for justice and accountability. Her courage in the face of intimidation not only discredited the officers, but also sent a clear message to others in the community. Standing up for what is right, even in the most challenging of circumstances, is both necessary and possible. The greater lesson that emerged from the confrontation was the importance of personal agency in the fight against injustice. It wasn't just about the woman asserting her rights. It was about everyone recognizing their own power to question authority and demand answers. Her bravery inspired others to not remain passive when faced with injustice, but to take action, whether big or small, to challenge wrongdoings wherever they occurred. In the weeks and months following the incident, more individuals began to come forward with their own stories. The community that had once been divided by fear or ignorance of such abuses began to unify around the idea that accountability must be enforced. Other residents who had felt powerless in the face of similar interactions with the HOA or other community figures, now found the courage to speak out. These stories, once hidden, began to surface, creating a collective understanding that the fight for justice was not just an individual endeavor, it was a community effort. The woman's stand became a symbol of resistance against those who misuse power, and it inspired a shift in the collective mindset of the neighborhood. The question of how many others had been subjected to similar abuses was not just rhetorical, it became a call to action. Investigations were launched, and local authorities began to look more closely at the practices of HOA groups and other organizations that wielded power over communities. The events that transpired set a precedent for how such abuses would be handled in the future. What might have been dismissed as a simple misunderstanding or a minor overreach was now recognized as part of a larger pattern of misconduct. The focus shifted from the isolated incident to a broader examination of how to prevent such abuses from occurring again. Furthermore, the aftermath highlighted the importance of vigilance and due process in all community operations. It became clear that oversight and regulation were necessary to ensure that those in power were held accountable for their actions. While many might assume that organizations like HOAs function smoothly and without incident, this case exposed the need for constant checks on those in positions of power. Without proper oversight, it becomes all too easy for individuals to exploit their roles and manipulate residents. The event sparked conversations about the importance of transparency and the right of every individual to challenge any authority that oversteps its bounds. The woman's actions also illuminated the broader societal implications of standing up against perceived injustice. By questioning authority and refusing to allow herself to be intimidated, she became part of a larger movement, one that involved raising awareness about power imbalances in all sectors of life. Whether in government, business, or community organizations, the events underscored the importance of self-advocacy, collective support, and the need for structural reforms that protect individuals from abuses of power. The community's response to the incident also reflected a changing attitude toward how power and authority should be exercised. Once the officers were exposed and discredited, the message became clear. Abuse of authority would not be tolerated. This shift wasn't immediate, and it didn't happen without resistance, but it set the groundwork for long-term change. The EA's woman's bravery acted as a beacon for others who had felt powerless, encouraging them to demand transparency and fairness in all aspects of their lives. Ultimately, the consequences of this confrontation were far-reaching. The officers, exposed for their illegal actions, faced disciplinary measures, and the wider community saw firsthand the power of standing up against injustice. The woman's decision to not back down sparked an essential conversation about justice and accountability, not just in this instance, but in every situation where authority is used improperly. The incident became a touchstone for future generations, a reminder that one individual's refusal to comply with injustice could lead to a broader societal shift, inspiring others to assert their rights and demand better from those who are supposed to serve and protect them.